Bennington Museum's online school programming is brought to you by a grant from the Charles R. Wood Foundation and the Stewart's Shops Holiday Match Fund. Hey everybody, this is Dina at Bennington Museum, and today I'm going to take you on a walking tour of the part of town we call Old Bennington. Any ideas why it's called Old Bennington? If you guessed it's because it's the oldest part of town, you are correct. When people first settled here back in 1761, they built their town way up here on the top of the hill. Later on, the town kind of moved downhill to where the river is because they needed the power from the river water to power their factories. But in the times of earliest settlement, the town was built on the top of the hill. So that part of town we now call Old Bennington. So that's where our tour will take us today. There's a few things you should know if you decide to do this tour on your own. One is that we start the tour in the Bennington Center Cemetery, right up here at the top of the hill at the museum. There's a nice view from up here. It's a good place to start your tour. Bennington Center Cemetery is pretty old. The oldest grave back there dates to 1762. So when we're in the cemetery, we try to follow some of the same kinds of rules we follow to protect things in the museum. Specifically, we try not to touch the stones. And we have to be careful where we walk, because sometimes they're on the ground. The other thing about this cemetery is that even though it's really old, it is still being used. So when we're in the cemetery, we have to be on our most mature, respectful behavior, just in case we encounter anybody that might be there visiting the grave of someone that they knew. The other thing you need to know if you take this tour on your own, in person, is that a lot of the tour takes place on private property. That means we'll be walking basically through people's front yards, and we need to be respectful of their private property by not littering or standing on their rock walls or picking their flowers or anything like that. All right, now we're gonna go on this tour. You're gonna come on it with me, but I'm not gonna do all the work. You guys should have a copy of this form, and it's got a lot of blanks in it. Now, if I do my job right, by the time we finish this tour, you will have all of the information you need to fill in all of those blanks, if you're being a careful listener and watching closely. So let's get started. From up here at the top of the hill at Bennington Museum, there's our parking lot down there. You can follow the little dirt path up here and then follow the wood line over to this little fence. We just cut right through the woods to get to the Bennington Center Cemetery. So let's go. And here, on the other side of the fence, is the Bennington Center Cemetery. It was the first cemetery in Bennington, and probably one of the first cemeteries in Vermont. We're going to head right out to the first main path. Past some of these great big old trees, and we'll head on up the path. You may notice that some of the graves have fallen down or broken. Mostly that happens because of weathering, right? And erosion. So every year the ground freezes and thaws and freezes and thaws, and the stones sometimes shift and break. But like I said, we're careful not to touch them because we don't want to hurry that along at all. This is our first stop. Now, there are 3 former governors of Vermont buried in this cemetery, but nobody in this cemetery is as famous as the person whose grave this is. His name was Robert Lee Frost. Does anybody know what Robert Frost was famous for? Well, if you're not sure, I can help you out a little bit. Here's something that Robert Frost was famous for. You ready? Whose woods these are, I think I know. His house is in the village, though. He will not see me stopping here to watch his woods fill up with snow. Did you guess that Robert Frost was a famous poet? Well, you're right. He was a very famous American poet, and he lived for a while right nearby in the town of Shaftesbury, Vermont. In fact, one of the houses that he lived in Shaftesbury is now a little Robert Frost museum. He actually chose this spot to be buried in, and he's buried here, and the names of a lot of his family members are on this grave as well. It doesn't mean that they're all buried here, but he has their names memorialized on this grave. So it's kind of like a kind of grave that's a memorial rather than the actual burial spot of a person. Let's check out the grave a little more closely. An epitaph is the words that are written on someone's grave, like a quote. So this tells us that his name was Robert Frost. It tells us he was born in 1874 and that he died in 1963. And his epitaph reads, "I had a lover's quarrel with the world." Does anyone know what the word quarrel means? It's a word we don't use terribly often anymore, but it's sort of like an argument or a fight. What does this quote tell us about Robert Frost? If he had a quarrel with the world, but he calls it a lover's quarrel, how do you think he felt about the world? Well, Robert Frost wrote lots of beautiful poems about nature and about people. He loved New England and to write about New England, but sometimes he had some pretty sad moods, pretty depressed moods. And maybe if we look at the memorials of some of the other people in his family, it might give us a little clue about why he had that quarrel with the world. Remember that he died in 1963. His wife, Eleanor, died in 1938. That's quite a while before him. His daughter, Marjorie, died in 1934, before either of her parents. His son, Carol, I know you usually think of Carol as being a girl's name, but back then it was also a boy's name. He died in 1940, also before Robert Frost. How about his son, Eliot? Eliot died in 1900. And how old was Eliot? He died in July of 1900. He was born in September of 1896. So to find out how old he was, you can subtract 1896 from 1900. He was not quite 4 years old. And he had a type of fever that nowadays we have a cure for, but back then they didn't. And Robert Frost, he didn't want to call the doctor. He didn't trust doctors, and he put it off, and finally when the doctor came, it was too late. The doctor couldn't save the little boy, and so Robert Frost often blamed himself for that little boy's death. Here's his daughter, Eleanor. How old was she when she died? That's right, she was less than 1 day old. Remember, this was in the 1907 she was born, and medical care was very, very different back then. We didn't know much about how to take care of pregnant moms or newborn babies, and sometimes they died of illnesses that nowadays we don't even have anymore. So out of Robert Frost's 6 children, 4 of them, plus his wife, died before he did. I guess that might give him some reason to have a bit of a quarrel with the world. Now, before we move on, I want to show you what's planted here near his grave. Do you know what kind of tree that is? If you guessed birch tree, you are correct. The birch tree was planted here by his grave by the Friends of the Robert Frost Stonehouse Museum to commemorate his poem, which was called Birches. So together as a class, maybe you can look up the poem Birches and read it together. It's kind of a fun poem about a young boy who bends down the young birch trees almost all the way to the ground, and then holding on to them lets them spring back, and he goes for a ride through the air. All right, let's continue on from Robert Frost's grave to another location. One thing you might notice in this cemetery is that a lot of plots have these fences around them. Well, when somebody dies and you want to bury them in the cemetery, you have to pay for their cemetery plot. So a lot of times families will purchase a big plot so that all of their family members can be buried together. And a lot of times they'll put it, back in the 1800s, they put a fence around it to show where their plot was. Sometimes they would make one big monument in the center of the plot that details everybody's information on it. And then the little stones that mark the individual buriers might just have a name on them, or even just the word mother, father. This one has just initials on it. So that's what those fences are all about. Most cemeteries don't allow them anymore because it makes it really hard to keep up the lawns and mow them the right way. A lot of people wonder about this blue building here. Once upon a time, it may have belonged to the cemetery caretaker or been a house for the leader of the church that's up behind it. But nowadays, it's a private residence right next to a cemetery. We also get a lot of questions about this. This is called a vault. And it's not used for this anymore. But back in the olden days, before they had lots of big equipment for digging holes, if somebody died when the ground was frozen, they had to wait until the ground thawed in order to be buried. So in the meanwhile, the coffin could be stored in a vault like that. All right, we're getting into the oldest part of the cemetery now. We're going to take a little detour and head over to where that American flag is. Have you learned at all about the Revolutionary War in school this year? If not, I'm sure you will. The Revolutionary War was the fight for freedom, independence of the colonies from Great Britain. It happened in the 1700s, mostly in the 1770s, and it's how our country was formed. Here we have this big stone monument, and it tells us that around this stone lie buried many patriots who fell in the Battle of Bennington, August 16th, 1777. So the Battle of Bennington was a Revolutionary War battle that happened near Bennington on August 16th, 1777. And if we come over here, it tells us the names of some of the American soldiers that are buried near here. And they all have very English-sounding names because most of the settlers, the first settlers in this area, had English backgrounds. So, Philip Eastman, David Harris, John Moore. But if we go around the other side, where some of the soldiers that were fighting for the British were buried, and we start looking at their names, interestingly, they do not sound very British. Friedrich Togel, Heinrich Gebers, Friedrich Hofmeister, Wilhelm Rust, Johann Teisenrath. Those names sound German. Well, what were the Germans doing there? Well, these German-speaking soldiers were actually hired by the British to help fight in the Revolutionary War. And most of the soldiers that were on the side of the British at the Battle of Bennington were German-speaking soldiers from two regions called Hesse and Brunswick. So they're called Hessian and Brunswick soldiers. And that's why their names are German. Now over here is an interesting fellow. This says, David Redding, Loyalist. What does the word loyalist mean? it's got that word loyal in it. At the time of the American Revolution, who do you think that a loyalist was loyal to? Well, the colonists, who we'll call patriots to make it easy, they were also called rebels. They were fighting for freedom against who? Against the British. So a loyalist was someone who was living here in the colonies, who was loyal to Britain. Not everyone agreed. We know that it's hard to make a lot of people all feel the same way about something. So in the colonies, some people were all for independence and breaking away from Britain. Others were loyal to the king and to Great Britain, and others were kind of undecided. It also tells us that he was executed in 1778. Executed means killed for committing a crime. David Redding was accused of supplying the British with stuff that they needed, like guns and other supplies. And he was executed for that crime. He was killed for committing that crime. He was killed by hanging, probably somewhere around here, because this would have been the center of town at that time. However, his story gets even more interesting after his execution, because the town wouldn't let David Redding be buried in their cemetery. He was a criminal. Worse than that, he'd been a spy. He was their enemy. So he couldn't be buried in the town. Instead, they gave his body to the town doctor. And the town doctor kept David Redding's skeleton in his office for the rest of his career. And then he passed it on to someone else, and they passed it on to someone else, until finally, in the 1920s, when Bennington Museum opened, David Redding's bones belonged to a doctor who was down in Williamstown, Massachusetts, not too far from here. And that doctor donated, or gave, David Redding's bones to the Bennington Museum. And for many years, you could come to the museum and open a drawer that had a glass top and look in it and see David Redding's bones. Well, in the 1980s, the museum decided that it was time to bury poor old David Redding, and his bones were brought up here and buried in the cemetery. So here he lies. All right, let's go on. People often wonder about these structures in the cemetery, these house-looking things. These are called mausoleums, and it's another type of burial. So instead of being buried in a grave in the ground, their coffins are placed in these mausoleums. And we can't go in one, but we may be able to peek inside. It's got a great big door, and somebody has the key. I don't know how well you'll be able to see in there, but you can see that there are drawers kind of built into the stone walls, and that's where the coffins would be. Usually these belong to pretty wealthy families. You'd need a lot of money to be able to afford to build a mausoleum for your family. All right, we're gonna head over this way now. I'm gonna show you the oldest grave in the cemetery. The first settlers of European descent didn't come to Bennington until 1761. And when they did, it was groups of families. And they came here in the summertime of 1761. And one of those families was the Harwood family. In fact, there's still places around here called Harwood Hill, the Harwood Inn. It's a name that has been around in this town for a long time. Well, one of those people was Bridget Harwood, and she came here among the first families. She was a widow, so her husband had already died, and she came here with her adult sons. Well, in November of 1762, Bridget Harwood died, and she became the first person to be buried here in the Bennington Center Cemetery. Now, kind of neat thing is that her grandson, who had been born in January, his name was Benjamin, he was actually the first baby born here in the town. He lived to be in his 80s, but it's kind of interesting that the first person who died was the grandmother of the first person who was born. So this here is really the oldest part of the cemetery. Let's continue. Now, I just told you that the oldest part of the cemetery was way down there, right behind the church. And yet, up here in the very front row of the cemetery are some of the very first settlers, or the graves of some of the very first settlers in Bennington. In fact, here is the grave of who's considered the very first settler, Samuel Robinson. He's like the founder of the town. And you can tell that he was important because the writing on his grave goes from top to bottom, basically tells you his whole life story. So his name again was Samuel Robinson. But all of the people in these first couple of rows of graves, right near the top, right near the road and the fence, are some of the earliest settlers in the town. So let's check out some of their names. We had Samuel Robinson. It's probably hard to see, but this is his wife, Mary Robinson. Here is Moses Robinson. Let's go over here. This one is the grave of James Breckenridge. He's an interesting person to look into if you ever have a chance. Mr. Thomas Henderson. And then even on the other side, let's see who's over there. Closest to the church here. We've got Mary Dewey, her husband, Eldad Dewey, and this guy. Look at this grave. That one's pretty cool. This is the gravestone of Jedediah Dewey, who was the first minister in town. And over here is the grave of Elijah Dewey. So all of these people were among the very first settlers of the town. And even though there was plenty of room in the graveyard when these folks died, they're jam-packed right up here, front and center, which is kind of a little bit strange. Well, that's because this wasn't where a lot of these people were originally buried. When these people died, this church here, the old first church, hadn't yet been built. And the cemetery extended back where we saw Bridget Harwood's grave, right up through where this church stands today. So a lot of these people, some of these earliest settlers, were actually buried where the old first church is now. For whatever reason, they decided that's where they wanted to build their church, and when they did, they either had to relocate the graves or leave them under there. While we're here, let's just take a moment to look around. There's the church. On that little island in the middle was where their original church building would have been. It was called a meeting house. And in that meeting house, all of the religious activities of the town took place, and all of the government activities of the town took place. Vermont wasn't part of the United States yet. When they became part of the United States, they had to make some changes. Because one of the ideals of the United States is this idea of separation of church and state. And that means that the churches aren't supposed to tell the government what to do, and the government isn't supposed to tell the churches what to do. So when Vermont became a state, they had to prove that they accepted the ideals of the United States. And they wanted to really demonstrate that very, very clearly. And so they stopped using the meeting house, and they built the new church, which was to be used only for religion. They also built a courthouse, which was to be used for all of the town business and all of the government business. This picture shows us the church. There it is. That's the church that's right behind me. And if we were to walk down the sidewalk that way, this building, which was the courthouse, would be a little further down, separated by the cemetery in between. Now, before I show you where all that was, I want to share with you this cool building across the street. Nowadays, it's a private residence, and people have a lot of questions about it because it's a great big building, but it's kind of fallen into a little disrepair over the years. The cool thing about that building is that it was built around 1770. And so, the original part of that building is what we can see from across the street here. When that building was first built, it looked more like this here. And in 1777, after the Battle of Bennington, when all of the prisoners were brought back here to Bennington and all of the soldiers came back here to Bennington, that building existed and was like a witness to that moment in history. So this ground that I'm standing on right now is where all of that happened. That building was called Dewey's Tavern, or Dewey Inn, and it operated as a hotel for a long time, until about the 1980s, when it became a private residence. It's a pretty cool building in our town. So let's continue on down the sidewalk to our next stop, and while we're doing that, I'm going to show you where about that courthouse was. There's a couple of ways you can tell where the courthouse was. One of them is this little path that leads from the road to the fence, and that would have been a path that brought you into the cemetery. The other way you can tell where the courthouse was by the dates on the graves. So these graves tell me this person died in 1777, this one died in 1803. Now I know that the courthouse burned down in 1869. So all of these graves are older than 1869. These are people that were buried before the courthouse burned down. Over here, the graves become much newer. And these graves all have dates after 1869. And they give us a pretty good idea of where that courthouse building was. That building there is another mausoleum. Here's another view, kind of a better view actually, of the church. And then as we walked down the path, we got to where the courthouse was. And now we're about here, where this building was. It was in the corner of what's now the cemetery. And even though in this picture it says that it's a tin shop, oh well, you can see that. There we go. Before it was a tin shop, it was the home of somebody by the name of Ethan Allen. Now maybe you've heard of Ethan Allen, or maybe you haven't. He's very famous here in the Bennington area and in Vermont. And he's really famous for starting a group called the Green Mountain Boys. He was the founder of that group, the Green Mountain Boys, and we'll talk a little bit more about them in just a minute. Okay, we've crossed the street. You can see the corner of the cemetery. And right here is a marker that lets us know that right around on that corner was where Ethan Allen had his house. And who was he again? The founder of the Green Mountain Boys. You got it. All right, let's continue on down the sidewalk. So you may be wondering, who were the Green Mountain Boys and why are they so important? Well, the Green Mountain Boys became famous later on for their role in the Revolutionary War, fighting against the British, but they actually started quite a while before that and for a different reason. It all starts in New Hampshire. This was before the American Revolution. And the governor of New Hampshire was a guy by the name of Benning Wentworth. Bennington, I think there might be some connection there. Well, Benning knew that one way that he could make money for his colony was by selling land in unsettled territories. And that's just what he did. He started by making his first town as far west as he could possibly go without anyone saying, hey, you're in New York now. And he chartered his first town there, named it after himself, and called it Bennington. And so Bennington grew, and in 1761 people started settling here, and they built their houses and their farms and their schools and their taverns, and everything was great, except for one little problem, and that was New York. Because New York had been selling the same land to different people. So when the New Yorkers came here to see their land, they found people already living here, and they said, "Hey, you're on our land, get out of here." And the people already living here, who'd bought the land from New Hampshire, were like, "No, you're on our land, you get out of here." And they started to fight over who the land belonged to. And it was for that reason that Ethan Allen started the Green Mountain Boys. They were to protect Bennington and the other towns in this area from the New Yorkers. Now, Ethan Allen, as I said, lived right across the street, and he and the Green Mountain Boys had their headquarters at a place run by Mr. Fay. It's called Fay's Inn or Fay's Tavern. It stood right around here where this house is now, and it's where the Green Mountain Boys kind of met to figure out how they were going to keep the New Yorkers away. Well, one of the Green Mountain Boys hunted a catamount. You might be wondering what a catamount is. Catamount is another name for a mountain lion. Some people call it a cougar or a puma. And one of the Green Mountain Boys hunted a catamount, took its body and stuffed it, and put it on top of the Catamount Tavern, facing west towards New York and snarling, so that the first thing any New Yorker coming into Bennington to try to claim their land would see was the snarling, vicious cat on top of the headquarters of the notorious Green Mountain Boys. Now, the Catamount Tavern itself burned down quite a while ago, but this statue of the Catamount, also facing west towards New York, marks the site of the Catamount Tavern. And this is what the Catamount Tavern looked like. We're going to continue up this street, which is now called Monument Avenue. But remember, back in the 1760s and 1770s, this was the center of town. This would have been Main Street, Bennington. Many of the houses that you see date back to the 1780s, some of them maybe even a little further back than that. Many of them have been added on to and changed over the years, of course. Most of the houses that you see are made out of wood. But not this one. This one is made out of brick. Now, all of the houses on this road today are private residences, meaning they're homes that people live in. But not all of them started out that way. This building started out with a different use. Take a good look at it. It's got a bell tower up there. It's made of red brick, and it has two entrances. What do you guys think the original use of this building might have been? What other kinds of buildings have bells on them and are often made of red brick? If you guessed a school, you're correct. This building, known as the Academy Building, was originally a school. Now, if it was a school, why do you think it had these two doors right next to each other? Take a moment to make a few guesses. The reason this school had two doors was that one was for the girls and one was for the boys. They were to enter and exit separately. Sometimes they played on separate playgrounds or sat on separate sides of the classroom. It sounds pretty strange to us, but it was the norm back then. If you look at some old school buildings, maybe there's one in your town, a building that maybe used to be the high school and isn't used anymore, sometimes you'll see separate entrances for the girls and the boys, carved right into the concrete over the entrances. Here's another interesting stop. Now, remember that Samuel Robinson came here along with some other families in 1761. when he did, there was no town here yet. There were no roads, no beautiful houses like the one across the street. When Samuel Robinson came here, he had to build a house out of what was available to him. That meant he had to build his house out of logs. So this marker tells us that near this spot in 1761, Captain Samuel Robinson built his first log cabin. His first house was made out of logs, or out of trees. Now, people didn't live in log cabins for very long. They had come from other towns in Massachusetts and Connecticut where they were pretty used to living in houses like that one across the road. And so pretty quickly, the people built a sawmill and were able to make lumber and build new, beautiful houses like that. But when they first came here, it was all logs. There's a lot of beautiful old houses here on Monument Ave. Some of them even tell us when they were built and by whom. That one tells us it was built in 1819 by Richard Carpenter. The next one tells us that it was built in 1828 by Ewell Robinson. Lots of Robinsons in the early days of the town. Like I said before, most of the buildings, all of the buildings on Monument Avenue now are private homes, but some of them started out with a different use, like this one. Now this one's different than all of the other homes on the street because it's made out of stone. There are a couple made out of brick, but all the rest are made out of wood, except for this one, made out of stone. Now, why do you think it would be good to build a building out of stone rather than wood? Well, we talked about a lot of buildings that had burned down, and that was kind of a big risk. But if I were to tell you this was a kind of workshop, and it was built in 1781, what kind of workshop, what kind of work did people do that might make them at risk for fire? Well, being a blacksmith was one job that required very, very hot fires. When you're a blacksmith, you're making things out of iron, and you need to really heat up that iron in order to soften it, to shape things into it. So a blacksmith workshop would be at high risk of fire. This was originally a blacksmith's workshop. And now it's a house. We're most of the way up Monument Avenue now, and there's one really good reason that it's called Monument Avenue. And that's what I'll show you next. Here we are at the end of Monument Avenue, and there in front of us is the Bennington Battle Monument. And in front of the Bennington Battle Monument is a statue of this guy, Colonel Seth Warner. Well, the Battle Monument helps us remember the Battle of Bennington, which, as you know, happened on August 16th, 1777. But that battle happened in two parts. And in the second part, the Green Mountain Boys really showed up and saved the day. And their leader at the Battle of Bennington was Seth Warner. So Seth Warner was the leader of the Green Mountain Boys at the Battle of Bennington. But wait a minute, I thought we said that Ethan Allen was the leader of the Green Mountain Boys. Well, by this time, Ethan Allen had been captured by the British, and he was in prison, and he missed the whole battle. But luckily, he'd been replaced by Seth Warner. The Battle of Bennington didn't take place here, though. It actually took place across the New York border in a little area called Walloomsac. The Bennington Battlefield is a New York state park, and we're here on a Vermont state park where the Battle Monument is. Well, the British were after supplies. That's why they wanted to attack Bennington. And this area is believed to be about where those supplies were located. That's one of the reasons that the Battle Monument was built here. Right now, it's June of 2020, and the Battle Monument is currently closed. But we're going to see if we can find Mary Lou, who takes care of the monument and runs this site, and see what she can tell us about the Battle Monument and maybe give us a sneak peek inside. Good news, I found Mary Lou. Hi, Mary Lou.
Hello.
And she's gonna take us in to the monument, and we'll get a chance to look around at the exhibits in the bottom and even go way up the elevator all the way to those big windows up there. That's 200 feet up. Let's go check it out. Okay, one of the first things that I like to show people when we're in here, and I don't know how well you'll be able to see it, but hanging over our heads is this giant cast iron cooking kettle. It weighs how much? 300 pounds? 400 pounds? I can't remember. Anyway, it's really heavy. And this was the kind of kettle or pot that the troops would have used to cook their food in for the soldiers. So you can imagine that they had to haul that thing around with them. They had no trucks or anything like that. It had to be pulled on carts by horses or oxen. Pretty neat. All right, let's see what's around the corner.
Notice the name of our dehumidifier.
It's the Revolution dehumidifier. Perfect for the battle monument. This is one of my favorite parts of the exhibit down here. It shows how the monument was constructed. So you get to see it from, it was barely started. Now it's come along a little bit more and a little bit more. And it was a long time ago. Mary Lou, what year did they start building the monument?
They laid the cornerstone in 1887.
They started it in 1887. And
on Bennington Battle Day.
On Battle
August
Day,
16th,
of course. And it took them until 1889 to finish it. And then it was officially dedicated in 1891. So you can see people were still getting around in horse and wagons. And one cool thing that I learned from here at the Battle Monument is that they actually built a railroad track, which you can kind of see in this picture, to haul the stones up here. Actually, there's a better shot of it there. You can see the man kind of standing in the railroad track. And that's how they transported the stone here. Now, as we go around the corner, there were a lot of different ideas for how the battle monument should be designed. Some people thought it should be a statue of a person. This one looks kind of more like a castle. They even had the idea that they would build the museum at the bottom of the monument. I'm glad they didn't, because the museum's a lot bigger than that. But they finally decided on this design that we have today, which you guys saw from the outside. Over here is a little diorama of the Battle of Bennington. So this would be the Bennington battlefield, and you can see all of the different sorts of people who were involved in fighting in the battle. And in the back there, those guys with the pointy hats, those are some of those Hessians and Brunswickers that we were talking about earlier. All right, I think we're ready to head up the elevator to the monument. Now, there is a staircase, but the staircase isn't used anymore. It was built a long time ago, and it's not really up to modern day codes. So nowadays we use the elevator. I didn't film the elevator ride because the lights aren't on in the elevator, but Mary Lou, how fast does the elevator go?
It goes 200 feet in 59 seconds.
200 feet in 59 seconds. That's pretty cool. So it takes about a minute to arrive here at the observation deck. And from the observation deck, we can see all sorts of cool things. We're looking to the west here. And you're better at telling me what I'm looking at than I am.
You're looking at the Taconic range of mountains. And Mount Anthony itself is not a green mountain, it's one of the Taconics.
That's right.
Here's a little bit of trivia. There's an earthquake fault that goes through Mount Anthony called the Taconic Fault.
Is that right? Oh boy, I live on the other side of Mount Anthony. Maybe we'll be separated.
Maybe I'll come down and visit you in a landslide.
And over here, we're looking to the north.
And there's where the Taconics meet the Green Mountains. Mount Equinox is a green mountain. The ones to the west are still called the Taconic Range. And then we have the industrial parks.
The beautiful industrial parks. And let's see, let's go over here. When we look out this window, we are looking to the south.
And this is the Berkshires.
This is the Berkshires. Now from here, we can see Mount Greylock, can't we?
You can, and that's the highest point in Massachusetts. And Mount Greylock is 1,000 feet higher than we are right now. So if you could see the monument from Mount Greylock, you'd be looking down on it.
And you know what? You can see the monument from Mount Greylock on a good day. And actually from here, on a nice clear day, you can see can you see the spire on the top? Oh yes, I see it. It's really hard to see, and you probably won't be able to see it on the camera. But if you were here, you could see the spire on top of Mount Greylock over there. All right, so we've covered we've covered
All but the east.
all but the east. So when we look to the east, we're looking towards New Hampshire, but we can't see New Hampshire because the mountains are in the way, right?
Right, and they are the Green Mountains. That's the
That's
Green
right.
Mountain range that goes up to Equinox.
Pretty cool.
And then of course Mount Anthony Golf Course, which is the oldest golf course in the state.
And here at the monument, they have these handy dandy little maps for you. So if you're like me and you have a hard time finding your way around, they help you out. Now, right now the monument is closed to visitors, but the grounds and the store are going to be reopening soon, right?
That's right, we plan to open July 1st.
All right, July 1st, and the Bennington Museum will be opening that weekend, July 3rd, so you can come visit us. Now, the elevator at the monument will not be open, so you won't be able to get up here yet, but that's okay. You can come again some other time in the future, and you got a chance to check it out today with me. All right, Mary Lou, let's head back down.
Okay.
Okay, so the monument's pretty cool. One last cool thing about it that you can see even if you can't go inside is this. Now, this monument is made out of a type of rock called limestone. It's a sedimentary rock, and it's got fossils in it. So if you see all those little swirly things that look kind of like snail shells, those are actually ammonite fossils. And ammonites lived millions of years ago. And scientists think they probably had a shell like a snail, but maybe tentacles like a squid. Another really fun thing I like to do when I'm here at the monument is this. I'm going to do it in the shade though. Is come around to the shady side of the monument, lay right down on the ground with my feet against the monument. There we go. And look up. Whoa. That's pretty cool. If you're learning about the Battle of Bennington, you're definitely going to want to know about this guy. This is General John Stark, and he was the leader of the American troops at the Battle of Bennington. And he very famously said to his troops before battle, "There they are, boys, we beat them today, or tonight Molly Stark sleeps a widow." And here in Bennington, we have a lot of things named after Molly Stark for that reason. Well, that's our tour. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope you had a good time, and I hope you managed to fill in all those blanks. I hope I managed to remember everything I was supposed to tell you. And I hope I get to see you at Bennington Museum sometime. If you do come visit us, make sure you stop and say hello. Bye!